Hello to our viewers. This is Pete Nicholls of Parents Beyond Breakup, charity here in Australia that looks after mums and dads post-separation. And we have a Parental Alienation Day special with Stan Korosi from Melbourne. I'm from Sydney. Stan, can I ask that for the purpose of the viewers that you introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Pete. Thanks for bringing me on today. And yes, tomorrow is a special day. So yes, I'm professionally a clinical counsellor, and for the last decade or so, I've worked specifically with alienated parents, mothers and fathers whose children have been induced to reject them. And so my specialty is in alienation, in the unwarranted separation between parents and children. And that's pretty much how I describe myself. I work as a consultant in the field, and historically I have helped mothers and fathers get back a relationship with their children where they can, and to live better with themselves if that's not possible. And increasingly, more recently, I'm doing more work through the family court, introducing remediations for parental alienation, where the court enforces by law the return of a child to a parent who's been alienated. We're seeing that more often now, which is a good sign.
Right. So you're the man that we should be speaking to today. So thank you for making the time to be here with us today. And look, I think the purpose of today is that we're going to share a little bit of basic insight into the phenomena itself. So this is not anything too advanced. It doesn't matter if you're someone that's gone through this, are going through it, or just trying to get a sense of what it is. That's the purpose of today. So Stan, thank you for helping us with that. Now, relatively speaking, this is quite a new phenomena. When I say new, I don't mean in terms of last year, but in the science of psychology, it's a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, are you able to give us a little bit of a potted history of
Sure.
the phenomena?
So the term parental alienation first came about in around 1985 with Dr. Richard Gardner. He was a child psychiatrist who observed odd phenomenon between children and parents where the child rejected a parent for really quite invalid reasons, for manufactured reasons, for reasons which were frivolous, irrational. And he then documented that, listing a number of criteria that then described a specific phenomenon. He attempted to call it parental alienation syndrome. Some of us would say that he was premature in attempting to do that, and it hasn't made the grade as a clinical category, a diagnostic category. But then neither has family violence. As I point out to a lot of people, there's no such thing as family violence syndrome.
That's interesting.
So, you're not going to diagnose anyone with family violence. So it is enough to describe that the phenomenon exists and it has unique qualities from any other phenomenon. So we've known about those unique qualities since 1985, roughly speaking, but historically, in human history anyway, the Greeks knew about it in their myths, the myth of Medea. So Medea was a Greek god, and her husband was Jason, another Greek god, and he was having an affair with yet another Greek god. And so Medea didn't think much of that, so she killed her children to punish Jason. Whoa. So that is the essence of the Greek myth of Medea. And so historically, because alienation was known about pre-1985, it was called Medea syndrome, where a parent would punish an errant parent by removing the child from them or killing the children or harming the child in some way. Now, historically, it was thought that mostly women alienate, which was Richard Gardner's original observation, which he subsequently changed. Now, that's actually not the case. There's plenty of good evidence that, unfortunately, men and women are equally good or bad, if you want to put it that way, in terms of parental alienation. So flipping it around, mothers and fathers are more or less equally victims of it, equally targeted by it.
And certainly we would back that. I mean, we support maybe upwards of 5,000 mums and dads across Australia, predominantly dads, but many hundreds of mums. And I've got to say that my own personal experience working at Parents Beyond Breakup is that you hear the same stories, both directions.
Yep.
more with dads than we do with mums, but the stories are identical the other way around. And it's something that I think is really worth understanding. If you're someone going through this, that it can equally affect a mum or a dad. It really can, genuinely. And that was a surprise to me coming into this sector myself. So I'm glad you mentioned that, actually.
Well, that's right, because at any given time, half of my clients are mothers and half of them are fathers. We've got 2 cases awaiting judgment in the family court right now that involve alienated fathers. Another one is being prepared, involves a mother. We've got other 4 cases working that involve mothers. So it's not, it is accepted, I think, simply by the fact that it happens. There's more or less equally mums and dads. Historically, I would say that family law, as in society, is typically that mums are the natural parents of their children. So if the marriage or the family breaks up, dad leaves and mum gets the children. So historically, alienation has been about playing that game at a societal and legal level. And so mums ended up with the children, and family law and child support was geared towards paying mum and eliminating the dads. Now, big changes were underway socially in the 1990s, and gradually family law started to equalise to the idea that actually children needed both parents in their lives. And why couldn't parents work out reasonable childcare arrangements between the 2 of them if their relationship ended? It's a great theory, but it didn't quite address the fact that humans have so many different ways of expressing how hurt they are in very angry and projective ways. And so, the theory is great, but the practice still hasn't quite worked out the way we would like.
Well, actually, it makes me think about something which is specific to Australia, and that is that if we look at the day that's marked for this recognition of this globally, it's the 25th of April, which clearly in Australia and New Zealand clashes with our Anzac Day down here. So there has to be a different date. The date for Australia and New Zealand is the 12th of October every year. And I guess what's interesting to me is that we do have, quite recently in the last few years, we've identified that date for this part of the world, which suggests that we're beginning to take it seriously here. Is that the case in your opinion, Stan?
I would suggest that at a social level and increasingly within family law, there's a greater understanding that an unwarranted rejection is harmful, specifically to the children involved, because they're induced to believe something about the parent whom they once loved that is incongruent with their past history of the relationship with that parent. So there's recognition that that is actually abusive to the child and is abusive to the rejected parent. And it's actually been in our Family Law Act since 2012. The family violence changes they brought into the Family Law Act have a definition of family violence. And I might read it out to you here if you don't mind. It's actually,
sure.
I would say it's one of the best examples of a functional description of parental alienation. Basically, a definition of family violence, preventing the family making or keeping connections with his or her family, friends, or culture. That cuts to the essence of it. That's what alienation is. There's no basis of those relationships. It's actually about preventing a relationship from happening, from a child enjoying a relationship with a parent when there's no reason to do so.
Yeah, and well, actually, that kind of leads me on to a point I wanted to make at some point, which was to clarify exactly, in your opinion, what is parental alienation and what is it not? Because as much as we all kind of maybe have a sense, those of us who are experiencing it or hearing about it, what it might be, what is it also not, in your opinion? What are the kind of common misconceptions?
Sure. A very common misconception and a common misunderstanding that occurs within clinical circles amongst psychologists, social workers, etc., and also within the legal field, is the idea that children resist or refuse, and I'm using their terminology, resist or refuse a relationship with a parent because of conflict in the relationship, typically around the divorce or separation. So it's this idea that somehow the family is splitting up, that's when the alienation occurs. In almost every case that I've worked on, and I think the research backs this up, the history of the alienation process predates by years, when the actual separation occurs. It's definitely magnified going through a very high conflict process like family law. And it's magnified by also engaging in the wrong kind of therapy that actually makes it worse. And so that's one of the major misconceptions. So children will refuse or resist a relationship with a parent for a number of reasons, not just alienation. One of them is because they're actually grieving over the loss of their family. And the only way they can express that is to be angry with the parent who's seen to be leaving. And so they actually love that parent. They don't want them to go, but it's unsafe for them to say so. So they don't. Okay. Typically, given the chance, those kids will reconnect with that parent if that process is recognized. That's not really alienation. It only becomes alienation when their favorite, the residential parent, plays on that and amplifies that. The other examples where can be a misconception is forms of family violence. So children who have witnessed family violence, and it can be not just physical abuse, seeing one parent hit another parent. It can be the verbal abuse that goes with it, the controlling dynamics around finances and religion and culture and other aspects. They respond to that. They can reject a parent whom they perceive as abusive, right? But at the same time, they're confused by the fact that the parent whom they love is capable of such actions. So they retain some ambivalence about their opinions and feelings about that parent. So they often still want a relationship with them. They just want it to be safe. So there's another misconception. But when alienation occurs, it's dramatically different.
Okay.
The markers is that children will lose any ambivalence about their parents and develop harshly polarized views where one parent is perfect and doesn't need to do anything to make themselves better. The other one is irredeemingly hopeless.
And actually, I think that's a characterization of what we see quite often. It's the extreme, in simple terms, extreme polarization without any kind of deep logical reason behind it.
That's right. Yeah. And I haven't seen a case of alienation without that characteristic in it somewhere. Okay. If that characteristic isn't there, it's less likely to be alienation, even if one or both parents aren't really behaving particularly well. Okay?
Well, look, moving on from the misconceptions about it, there's quite a bit of pushback in our experience as well from the system, from various kind of lobby groups, etc., even using the term parental alienation.
Yeah.
People saying it doesn't exist. Do you have a sense of why that is, or where are people coming from when they say it's not real?
Well, okay, so I'm very clear that it's real. So I've given evidence several times now in the family court, and I've written assessment reports about cases in which we asked to remediate. And I use the term alienation. Okay. And if I'm cross-examined about that, those are the terms I use. So the reason people don't like the term parental alienation goes back to its politics and goes back to how it was originally formulated in the 1980s. And back then, when society and family law was principally oriented towards mum being the preferred parent, alienation was seen as what women are doing to men. It was also, as I mentioned before, perhaps prematurely defined as a syndrome before the science had really caught up with it. The third reason people don't like the term parental alienation is because historically it was used as a defense against claims of sexual abuse against children, which subsequently proved to be correct. So in other words, the allegation of parental alienation was actually a false defense against the crime actually happening. So got a bit of a sullied name. I think that the fog has cleared, in my view, on that one over the years. There's a lot of politics around the term parental alienation. My politics are clear. It's an accurate description of the phenomenon. You know, it is about a parent inducing it in a child. A parent is affected by it, as well as the child. And alienation, as I've said before, is the process of instituting an unwarranted separation. That's an adequate description. It's a good description. You can call it coercive, controlling family violence if you like, because actually it is. You're coercing a child to accept the view of a parent they once loved as a condition of having a relationship with their favoured parent. So that's coercive.
Yep.
And you're controlling the child by managing the time they spend, if at all, with their other parent, and controlling all aspects of their belief system and their emotions around that other parent. So yes, resisting and refusing dynamics, yeah, that's another description. All of those descriptions are what I call child-centric, which speaks to our family law system and our social system that puts children first.
Yeah.
We're all agreeing on that. But I would say if you don't put the rejected parent equal first, you haven't got a solution to the problem. Okay.
Yeah.
You've got to recover, help the alienated parent recover themselves, recover their identity, because they are the means by which the child recovers. And when we do remediate a relationship between an alienated child and their rejected parent, that child heals very quickly. It's remarkable.
Yeah, we've both heard that academically, but we also see that in the cases that we deal with. I mean, not that long ago, again, obviously not naming any cases here, but there was one dad we worked with, 8 years of not seeing his daughter, continual rejections in the 3-4 years leading up to the period they got reunited, and within a day, everything was back to normal, apart from the broken hearts that have been left behind.
Yep.
It's really curious how quickly things can reverse.
It does some really complex psychological and social processes that children have to use to defend themselves against the harm.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's a weapon that works equally against themselves. They have to hurt themselves to survive.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I guess that's an area that maybe I'm not going to go into today, but it is, I would say, to many people, a form of child abuse as well.
Well, it is. I've no doubt about it, and I always use the term child psychological abuse or maltreatment together with alienation. So we're very clear what it is. You know, for whatever motivations, one parent is harming their child in order to harm the other parent.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think from listening to you, what's clear is that our understanding of it, the terminology is evolving. I think one of the things that leads me to think about and to ask you is who the experts in this field are, because when we're working with parents, we hear about legal experts who have some expertise around how do I deal with this in the courtroom? What terminology do I use? How do I present evidence? We then read white papers from academics who do pure research. We also hear about expert witnesses who come to court. And I believe that's something you do. And I'm going to ask you to speak to that in a moment.
Sure.
And give professional insight and reports to the judges. So there are different kinds of experts. It'd be really interesting for someone like yourself, who's at the pointy end of this. Can you help demystify the subtle differences between who the experts in this field are and what their angle is? How do they interact with the system and the sector and the parents, etc.?
I've always said to certainly the parents I work with that it's better for them not to think of me as an expert, because no one person contains the single body of knowledge about this. And I always say to them, you should check out other people like Amy J. Baker, for example, or Mandy Mathewson at the University of Tasmania, or, there's lots of other people, Bill Burnett at the Parental Alienation Study Group, Demosthenes Larandos, or I can't remember his name. Joshi is his last name. He's just written a book about parental alienation in the law. So there are lots of academic and research experts out there. Jill Harmon's another one who's done research that's linked parental alienation and family violence together. So many of these people are academic and research experts. Some of them have actually worked with people in a clinical setting. They have very similar and in some cases slightly different views. It's best if I talk about what I've noticed and observed in my experience of working on the periphery and within family law.
Mm-hmm.
So for professional political reasons, it looks like family consultants in Australia, and these are the people who to family and advise the judge on what's going on and what their recommendations are very reluctant to use the term parental alienation.
Mm-hmm.
But their observations are incredibly accurate in describing actually parental alienation. So they'll often throw in the word alienation and sort of like, it might be, not sure, looks like it could be. They'll use terms like, it seems to be the rejection is unreasonable. Okay. They'll identify when a parent is coaching a child into believing something that didn't happen. So they will describe the phenomenon in excruciating detail, but they won't say at the end, this is a case of parental alienation, you must reverse care and responsibility to the other parent.
Well, actually, that leads me to another question in my mind, which is, to what extent do you find that the courts are recognizing the phenomena? And I'm being careful not to use the terminology, because I know that they don't necessarily recognize the terminology, but are they recognizing and dealing with the phenomena in your experience? Is it changing?
I think it is changing. I'm thinking of two cases in which I gave evidence in the last, three cases I gave evidence in the last 12 months. Just so you know, Pete, you're cutting out here and there, so I don't know how much of my narrative is coming through.
You're cutting out little bits, but I'm able to follow it. So with a bit of luck, it'll still make sense with the little bits.
Tag together, yeah. Yeah, welcome to the NBN. There you go. So I'm thinking of the three cases I've worked on in the last 12 months where I gave evidence. In each of those cases, if you search the Australian database on family law cases using the term alienation, they won't come up. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because it's not a term that was used in the reasons for judgment. But every one of those cases described the phenomenon of the child being made to believe something about their rejected parent that was simply false. It just wasn't reasonable, wasn't borne out by the history of that relationship, and all the markers of alienation were described.
Yeah.
In each of those cases, the judges decided to reverse parental care and responsibility. So they, ipso facto, they accepted on the face of the evidence that these children were being psychologically abused. The two main ways the abuse happened was that their rejected parent's identity was impugned, damaged, their parental identity was deleted. So, for example, in all these cases, the children referred to their rejected parent by their first names, sometimes as them or it or they, okay?
The other, it's the other. Yeah.
It's the othering, yeah, exactly right, okay? So that was a red alert. In each of those cases, that rejected parent was stigmatized within their family, and it became a condition of the child's relationship with the favored parent that they rejected the other parent, okay? So in each of those cases, without calling it, headlining it, parental alienation, the judges took exception to that.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Stan, so if they're not using the term parental alienation, is there a term that is generally recognized? I mean, I've heard terms such as pathogenic parenting, which might be recognizable to the law, or is it a case of it's more in the description of the phenomena, but there still isn't a name that's generally understood?
I think what seems to resonate within family law is the concept of child psychological abuse or maltreatment. And the definitions of psychological abuse and maltreatment include a concept called corruption of the parent-child relationship. So in almost every one of the cases that we would otherwise call parental alienation, the relationship between the child and their favoured parent becomes something other than a parent-child relationship. So the child becomes a parent to their parent, or becomes an adult to that parent. In other words, a parent confides in their child as though they were an adult, okay? Or that parent, or that child parents their parent. So there, the child's development stops because they're no longer a child anymore. They have to be somebody else. And family consultants seem to be very, very good at picking up those dynamics, but calling it something other than what it is for political and professional reasons.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, the phenomena that you've just described, I've seen in reports described as parentification.
Yep, parentification, adultification, and an even more dangerous one, infantilization. So infantilization is just a complicated way of saying when a parent maintains a child at a child level that's inappropriate for their age and stage. So we're working on a case right now where we've got a 10-year-old child who can't go to the toilet by themselves. They have to go with their favoured parent.
Wow, that is interesting.
In a dependent state, and it's actually highly abusive to that child. Okay?
So is that what we often also hear about, an enmeshed relationship?
Yeah, well, enmeshed and corrupted are, because an enmeshed relationship is one where the nature of the connection between, say, parent and child confuses the boundaries. We're not really sure who's the parent, who's the child. Okay. In a corrupted relationship, it's enmeshment on steroids, with child acting as a parent, acting as an adult, or being kept in a childlike state inappropriate for their age and stage. So it's an even worse case of enmeshment where the child is actually being exploited to be something other than a child. Okay. And that's incredibly harmful. And we can pick those dynamics out. And, you know, so for example, a parentified child will attempt to defend the parent they're parenting and basically echo or parrot their ideas, their views, their feelings about the other parent, as though they thought of it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And we can pick that up. Now that's, when we get to that level, we are really talking about quite severe presentations. So I would say family law in Australia, it's constrained by its legal framework around the child's best interests. And the problem with that child's best interest is that it doesn't have as to which parent may be better for the child, or even if both parents are best for the child. So historically, what's happened in family law, certainly in Australia, is that they perceive that this is a result of conflict, and they get rid of the parent who they see as causing the conflict. Historically, that's usually the alienated parent because their only option is to take action. So they're seen to be the ones creating the problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we are turning that around to say that alienated parent fighters, and they're taking a stand for their children. And if they frame their evidence the right way, it grabs attention.
Yeah, yeah. So look, actually, that leads me to my next thought, which is around, I mean, you're describing your work with a number of cases here in Australia. What does a typical case of parental alienation look like? I mean, you've touched upon it previously by saying it starts long before. It might necessarily start long before the actual separation itself, but what does a typical story look like? Obviously not naming any names or picking on any individuals, but describe it so that others can say, is that me, or is that someone I know? Very often, a case that I get involved in, I get involved in the really severe. I've got a team of people that I work with, and we work at different levels. Sometimes we work together on cases, and sometimes, you know, cases aren't as severe, and so we have a different graduated response
that we can use in those cases. The cases where I get involved, they become strongly polarized cases. One parent will say, I'm a victim and my child is a victim of family violence. This man or this woman is coercive, controlling, physically violent, sexually violent, and so on. Okay. And the other parent is saying, no, that's not right. This is a case of parental alienation. So we basically, the cases in Australia tend to be family violence versus parental alienation. That's the battleground.
That's an interesting characterization, actually, not something I've kind of thought about myself. So that's a good insight. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So the three cases, most recent ones I've worked on where I've given evidence, all of those cases had claims of family violence and sexual abuse leveled against the alien, and the alienated parent was maintaining that, well, actually, no, this is actually, with our help, child psychological abuse, maltreatment by alienation. So this is really hot stuff, because you've got typically a woman, a mum, claiming that they are the victim of severe family violence, and the only safe thing for their child is that there's no further contact with the other parent. And then you've got the rejected parent saying, no, that never happened, or didn't happen in that way. And the only safe thing for the child is that they live in my sole care and responsibility. Now, family law will only allow one of those possibilities. Which one is it going to be? Okay. So when I get involved, I have to look at basically the expert witness reports and analyze the narratives and figure out, well, what is actually happening. So we know the difference between a family violence case and an alienation case because of the different way the children respond, and because the alienation parents behave in very, characterful ways. Their behaviours are notable because of the effect they have on their child. So then, essentially, to be blunt, family law is hand-to-hand combat. That's what it is.
It's an adversarial system, yeah.
Yep, it's the adversarial system. These cases are so severe, they don't resolve with therapy. They don't resolve in mediation. In fact, that they don't work because they make the situation worse. So these cases go to trial with a history of failed interventions. So the only real solution is the child is going to live with one parent or the other, but not both. So in each of these cases where family violence is alleged, and it's alleged by fathers as well as by mums, so it's not sort of, just mums doing it to dads. Often maintain that mums are, sexually inappropriate with their children, or neglectful, or they're mentally unstable in some way, or have a history of mental illness. Well, let me tell you, there's a lot of parents out there with mental health histories who are pretty good parents. Okay. Yeah. So, that by itself isn't really enough. So in each of those cases, the judges generally find that there's no basis to the claims of family violence. So in the sad and perhaps tragic thing with those parents who make those claims of family violence is that many of them have childhood histories of their own abuse in their families of origin. And to put it simply, they can no longer tell the difference between what happened to them in the past and what's happening to them in the present.
That's an interesting insight as well. Actually, it leads me to kind of ask you if you're able to maybe expand a little bit on the relative experience of mothers versus fathers. What's common, what's different?
Sure. So both mothers and fathers, in my experience and what's borne out by the research, they're both acutely aware in their own ways that they are stigmatized in their own family and in society. Men differently to women. So for men, for fathers, they are constructed within their own family as typically a violent and abusive man who has to be pushed out because he's dangerous, he's unsafe. Okay? But out there in the community, often these men find familiar company with other men who've been through the same thing. So it's almost like alienation is a shared male experience.
Mm-hmm.
They are ostracized and stigmatized in social settings like schools, in the workplace. So some schools, I regret to say, don't handle the situation particularly well, not from a very neutral position, and they'll just exclude a father because we just focused on the child safety here, whether it's true or not. Okay. So men struggle in their own way with their sense of identity, because the key to being stigmatized is that your identity, your social identity as a parent is damaged in some way. You're made out to be violent and abusive. And so it's so easy to get an intervention order, for example. You just need to spin a pretty coherent story together for the police. And certainly the police, at least here in Victoria, are required to issue an order by law just as a matter of safety. So there's a further stigma attached to having an intervention order that tags you as a potentially violent man. So men often feel they have to work against this identity that's collapsed upon them that doesn't reflect who they are. Mm-hmm. Okay. For women, for mums who are alienated, they often feel a profound sense of failure as a mother, because their social construction as mothers and parents is around, well, I have a relationship with my child has a relationship with me, I love my child, they love me. And if a child rejects a mum, well, they must have done something to deserve that. So they've kind of failed at mothering. Fathers often construe themselves as failing as a protector and provider. One of the things that still haunts me was a father I worked with some years ago in relation to his alienated children, who said to me, "This happened on my watch." So he was feeling like he'd failed at protecting his family, he's protecting his children.
Yeah.
So they're different aspects of the same process of deliberately damaging a parent's identity and then deleting their identity within the family and making that a condition for the child to have a relationship with their favorite parent.
And look, I mean, just personal observation from working with hundreds of parents, it's always profoundly painful to be on the receiving end of alienation. There's no doubt about that. It's profoundly agonizing. But it's interesting that, as you say, that men will clump together. There's a lot of them out there, and there's a shared sense of problem. There's like a club, if you like. For mothers, I would say on some levels it can be more difficult because society doesn't recognize why would the child be removed from you. And
That's
so
right.
In our experience, maybe the numbers are smaller with mothers, but the pain is far more acute, or it's a very pointy kind of difficult problem that society really struggles with. Whereas with fathers, it kind of recognizes it a bit more.
It's an interesting observation you make there about, we've talked before, I think, around men and how the power of shame.
Yeah.
Yet there is the power of shame for women too, at having perceived that they've failed at mothering, and the way they internalize that failure as their own identity. And part of working with both mums and dads who have been alienated is helping them really to take a stand, because until they do, they can't be effective in terms of working with their children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And look, actually, that leads me to think about the children themselves. I mean, I've been asking you about the mums and the dads, but what's a typical impact on a child? I mean, we spoke earlier about it kind of borders on, if not is, actual child abuse, but what does it do to a child? Now, and, that will vary dramatically, whether it's 6 months or 16 years worth of exposure to this, I imagine. But can you give us a potted kind of overview of what's the impact?
Broadly
on a child?
speaking, and Amy J. Baker wrote a great book about adult survivors of parental alienation.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't realize.
Yep. Yeah. And so there's been a lot more research done since her book. I think it was 2012. It's certainly done in Australia. That shows that adult alienated children basically are at higher risk of repeating the alienation in their own lives, of being attracted to partners whom will alienate them or they will alienate. They're at greater risk of self-destructive behaviours, of mood disorders like depression and anxiety, and generally struggling in their social relationships because their learnt behaviour is that when you have a disagreement with someone, the way to deal with that is to cut them out.
That's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, we've seen that. We've seen that.
You cut them out because that's what they've been brought up with. Okay, you delete the person. It's no surprise we have cancel culture as a social phenomenon now. Okay.
What an interesting observation. Yes. Yeah.
Yep. This is the effect of a socialized alienation that's happening around us. Cancel culture, ghosting are forms of instituting an unwarranted separation. Rather than say to someone, look, I'm sorry, but I don't think we see eye to eye on this one, you just don't talk to them.
Well, of course, as social animals, what's the worst thing you can do to an individual animal? It's to exclude them, stick them on the outside.
Which is what they have learned. So it becomes intergenerational. It becomes transmitted through society and becomes normalized. Unless we protest about it, it becomes our normal way of doing business.
Yeah.
So working backwards from the adults. So basically their presentations, they are at higher risk of having the same adverse life outcomes as though they were sexually abused, roughly speaking. It's not any different, really. I have a haunting memory of working with a family recently, and I had to separate a 14-year-old young man, young adult boy, from his older siblings. And when we got him away from these older siblings, I looked into his eyes and they were like dead and cold. And he did not have a single opinion of his own, have an idea that he could formulate himself. Everything that he knew, everything that he thought was told to him. And when he was away from the people who told it to him, he could not say anything at all. Some of the kids that we've seen in these settings have almost been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, anxiety disorders. In each of those cases, when we break the relationship with their rejected parent, those disorders, so-called disorders, disappear. All of a sudden, they're not on the autism spectrum. All of a sudden, they're engaging with school. They're not depressed, they're not anxious. So what we know is that the process of alienating, the process of corrupting a relationship, of inducing a child to reject a parent they feel in their heart they love, that creates all sorts of harms that become permanent. The longer we leave it, the more harm that they cause. Just a couple of examples.
Okay, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
Look, I'm just conscious, Stan, I'm loving this conversation. I could talk to you all day, but I'm just conscious that time is running on. So look.
I've lost track of time.
It's okay. Well, it happens when you're in the middle of an interesting conversation. Sure. I think we're going to have a revisit on this. But
happy to do that.
As we kind of moving towards the end of this kind of little session today, might I ask you to kind of observe for us, or maybe kind of 3 or 4 key bits of insight, wisdom that you'd want to share to a parent who's experiencing this? Like, what's your top 3 things that they should be recognizing, doing, thinking, whatever it happens to be? So
number 1, if you have suspected this is happening, typically this is too big for one person alone. You need a team effort, okay? And the metaphor I use is, there is no Olympian who's trained themselves to be, to win the gold medal. Okay, every Olympian has had, if not one coach, several. Okay, so you need a coach. And I use the word coach, not therapist. There's nothing wrong with you. Okay, you just need to learn some extra special tricks and to start parenting at an Olympic standard. So that's the first thing. The second thing is not your fault. You didn't cause this. So don't assume responsibility for it, but do assume accountability for change. Okay, Turn yourself into a change agent, an agent of cultural change, and a freedom fighter for your children. Okay. Now, how you fight and how you disrupt is very strategic. Okay. And the third thing is you've got to survive this no matter what. If it comes to the crunch and you can't get a relationship back with your children, you've got to walk out of the courtroom or mediation or therapy or whatever you're doing with your head held high and your identity intact.
Actually, I really like that. I mean, I think all three are phenomenally good insights, and thank you for that. And I'm sure our viewers will too. But the third one resonates with me as well, because a phenomena that, I mean, you can probably see that I've got grey hair now and a grey beard. I didn't at the start of this journey.
I would if I had hair, but there you go.
But, you know, one of the things looking back on 20 years working in this field with, over that time, thousands of parents internationally, there's a really interesting thing that tends to happen when you look at these cases over a long period of time, which is where reintroduction does occur. Quite often, a parent who is alienated will be driven into the ground with stress and anxiety, and they will self-destruct to the point where if the reintroduction does occur 10, 15, maybe 20 years later, and that grown-up child is trying to re-find that parent they remembered as a small child, they can't find them anymore. So actually self-care is a really important thing to leave in the mind of a lot of these alienated parents, that one of the responsibilities you possibly have still as a parent, even when you're alienated, is to look after yourself. It's that,
that's right. Yeah.
It's like first put your own mask on before you kind of help others, because you need to be around, you need to be sane, and that same parent. And that's difficult, but it's a necessity.
It is difficult in a society that expects parents to be sacrificial, particularly mothers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think your metaphor of put your mask on first, I think that sums it up. That's great. That's your metaphor. You thought of that one, and it's great. Okay. It really sums it up.
I stole it from someone else.
Well, I'm attributing it to you.
Right.
I think it's great. It really sums it up. Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, Stan, thank you for that. I think we're going to have to kind of draw it to a halt today, but we might ask you to come back and do a bit of a follow-up, because I think it's been wonderful talking to you. I have learned so much from you. We'll be posting this video.
That's fine, Pete. I'd be pleased to do that.
Well, look, we'll be posting this on YouTube and on our various Facebook and website, etc. And we'll also be linking your most recent blog article, which I thought was brilliant. Alienated Parents Reclaim Your Identity. It's not for sale. So we'll be linking that underneath.
Right.
And look, I would urge the mums and dads, grandparents, grown-up kids who are interested in this subject to go to Stan's website and sign up. There's a free newsletter. Doesn't cost anything. Stan, would you share details with our viewers? How do they find you? How do they stay connected with you? How do they get your help?
Sure. The quickest way to find me is probably through my website, dialogueingrowth.com.au, one word. And there's plenty of information there. You don't have to sign up to the newsletter. You know, there's no Stan Club that you have to be a member of. You can find.
I'll be the first member.
You know, I don't work that way.
Okay, all right.
But, you know, you can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook as well. So, and I think on Twitter. So I've been silent over the last few years while I've been trying to finish my PhD. So that's, you know, being examined now. So I'm starting to get a bit more active and leveraging what I've learned from the parents I've researched.
So when do you get to hear, just out of interest?
I wish I had an answer to that, but I'm probably about halfway through the examination process now. So we've got examiners reading it. So, yep, controversial subject. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what they think.
Okay, well, Stan, look, thank you so much for this. And look, if I might be slightly cheeky, I wonder whether you would honor us with your presence again. You've suggested you might do, but could we maybe ask you to come back and do a little bit of a workshop, maybe a brief workshop where you go into a bit more detail and maybe take a few questions from our mums and dads?
I'd be happy to do that.
Wow, you're a gen. You're an absolute gen. Stan, listen, I'm sure there's so many more things we could talk about, but look, I think we've covered the basics. There's a limit to how much we can do in one go. thank you so much.
Well,
I
thank
really
you,
appreciate
Pete.
the time.
I feel I've been honoured today. It means something to me for you to spend the time with me today. Thank you.
Cool. You're welcome. All right. Thank you, Steph.